April 10th, 2008, in Portsmouth, Virginia. It started out like any other sunny spring day. For 16-year-old Megan Landowski, it was just a normal day. School, then dance practice. But by the time her stepfather got home from work, this quiet, peaceful town was about to be absolutely shattered by a crime so brutal it left investigators just reeling. They were wondering who could possibly be capable of this kind of rage. And the scariest part? The killer was hiding in plain sight.
Those are the chilling words of Chris Short, Megan's stepfather, a naval captain. He's describing the exact moment he walked into his own home. The front door was unlocked, which was weird. An eerie silence just hung in the air. He called out for Megan, his stepdaughter, but nothing, no reply. And when he walked into the kitchen, he was met with an image that would be burned into his memory forever. Megan, lifeless on the floor in a pool of blood.
So, when the police arrived, they walked into what would be one of the most disturbing crime scenes of their entire careers. Those first few moments of any investigation are absolutely critical, and what they found here, well, it started to paint a really terrifying picture of Megan's final moments.
The forensics team started to piece together a chilling timeline almost immediately. First off, the killer wasn't invited in. They'd forced their way through a first-floor window. The attack, it seems, began upstairs, in Megan's own bedroom, where there were clear signs of a violent struggle. They found a duct tape dispenser, and there was physical evidence right there on the bedding that pointed to a sexual assault. But the horror didn't stop there. Megan's body was then moved from her room, downstairs, and into the kitchen, and that's where the final brutal act was carried out.
The sheer violence of it all was just staggering. A later autopsy would confirm that Megan had been stabbed over 40 times. Many of those wounds were to her face, her neck, and her chest. Now, detectives have a word for this level of rage. They call it overkill. It's an attack that goes so far beyond what's necessary to end a life. It's personal, it's frenzied, and it told investigators one thing for sure. This was not random. The killer knew Megan, and they were filled with an absolutely unimaginable fury.
So here's the problem for the police. There were no witnesses, the murder weapon wasn't left at the scene, and the killer, they had just vanished in broad daylight. The police were totally stumped, and you can imagine the community was gripped with fear. A violent predator was on the loose, and suddenly everyone was a potential suspect.
But just as the investigation seemed to be hitting a dead end, Megan's grieving parents gave detectives their first and only lead. They were absolutely certain they knew who had done this.
The name they gave police was Keith Camp. He was a friend of the family. And he wasn't just some random person they knew. He had a powerful, clear-cut motive for wanting Megan gone.
Let's just look at the timeline here, because it's pretty damning. Just 5 months earlier, Megan had bravely reported to the police that Camp had sexually assaulted her. That case was moving forward, and a trial was right around the corner. With Megan as the key witness, Camp was facing serious prison time. But without her, the case would completely collapse. For the police, this was pretty much the strongest motive you could ever ask for: silence the accuser.
Now, a search of Keith Camp's home, it didn't turn up any bloody clothes or a murder weapon. But a look at his computer revealed something really disturbing. Investigators were able to recover deleted files that contained child pornography. And while, look, it wasn't direct evidence linking him to the murder, it definitely painted a picture of a man with a very dark side, and just strengthened their belief that he was their guy.
When they questioned him, Camp denied absolutely everything. He claimed he was at work on the naval base all day, but his alibi, it had some holes. It was definitely possible he could have slipped away, committed the murder, and then returned. So, with this powerful motive and some pretty suspicious circumstantial evidence, investigators really felt like they were closing in. The whole case against Keith Camp really rested on this one single piece of evidence: the DNA from the semen found on Megan's bedding. If it was a match, the case was solved. It was as simple as that. Everyone, the family, the police, they all just held their breath waiting for those lab results. But when the results finally came back from the lab, the entire investigation was turned completely on its head. This was a result that absolutely no one saw coming.
It wasn't him. Keith Camp's DNA was not a match to the killer's DNA found at the scene. He was innocent. Of the murder, anyway. The one man everyone was so sure had killed Megan Landowski was suddenly and completely cleared. I mean, this was just a devastating blow. Not only was the real killer still out there, but Megan's family now had to face this horrible reality that her sexual assault case against Camp would probably be dropped. Police quickly tested the DNA of other family members, including her stepfather, and ruled them all out.
So they were left with a DNA profile of a killer they knew had to be familiar to Megan, but whose identity was a total mystery. So, detectives had to pivot. They turned their attention to Megan's life outside the home, diving headfirst into the complex social world of her high school. They interviewed dozens and dozens of friends, classmates, ex-boyfriends, anyone who might have held a grudge. They collected tons of DNA samples from male students, but every single test came back negative. Weeks turned into months, and with no new leads, the case went completely cold.
For 6 long months, there was absolutely nothing. The family was starting to lose hope. Then, a small tip from an informant gave police a list of names, boys Megan had been friendly with. All but one of them had already been interviewed and cleared. But that one new name, that was about to break this case wide open.
The name was Robert Barnes. He was a quiet but talented 16-year-old violinist who went to the same school of the arts as Megan. He wasn't a close friend, more of an acquaintance. He had a clean record and, honestly, he seemed like a really unlikely suspect. But, detectives have to follow every single lead. And this is where things just get bizarre. When the detective asked Barnes for a routine DNA sample, a simple cheek swab, he flat out refused. He said his mother would be against it. Okay, that's an immediate red flag for any detective. Then the very next day, he calls back and says, okay, I'll cooperate. He meets the detective and hands over a piece of gum he'd been chewing. But when the lab analyzed that sample, they made a shocking discovery. The DNA on the gum was female. He had tried to trick them.
Think about it. An innocent teenager would have zero reason to go to such extreme lengths to avoid a simple DNA test. This bizarre, clumsy deception immediately catapulted Robert Barnes right to the top of the suspect list. So, police brought him in for a formal interrogation.
And during that interrogation, Barnes made a fatal mistake. He was trying to act helpful, trying to play it cool, and he casually mentioned that the murder had happened on a Thursday. Now that one little detail, the day of the week, had never, ever been released to the public. Only the police and the killer knew it. And in that exact moment, Detective McDaniel knew. He was sitting across the table from Megan's murderer.
Realizing he was caught, Barnes confessed. Well, sort of. He came up with this wild story. He claimed a man in a mask forced him at gunpoint to assault Megan and take part in the murder. He even said the masked man cut his finger, which was a desperate attempt to explain why his own DNA might be at the scene. But the evidence just shredded his story. There was only one killer's DNA profile found, and the sheer rage of over 40 stab wounds? That's not the work of some hired gun. That is personal. His whole story was a lie.
With his fabricated story completely dismantled by the hard evidence, Robert Barnes had nowhere left to hide. The truth, as horrific as it was finally coming out. So, in the end, 17-year-old Robert Barnes pled guilty to first-degree murder and aggravated rape. He was sentenced to 42 years in prison, and justice, at least in a legal sense, had been served. But one giant question still hung over everything. Why? Barnes never gave a motive.
The investigators' best theory is that Barnes had romantic feelings for Megan, and when she rejected him, it unleashed a hidden, violent rage he'd kept bottled up inside. He was the quiet kid in school, the talented musician, the killer hiding in plain sight. And it really leaves us with a chilling final thought. The monster isn't always a stranger out there in the shadows. Sometimes it's the person right next door.